The meeting of the Subcommittee on Health will come to order. I'll recognize myself for an opening statement initially. We're here today to mark up H.R. 2749, the Food Safety Enhancement Act of 2009. We've been working on this bill, as many of you know, for a long time. Both Mr. Dingell and I introduced our first food safety bills 11 years ago. And in the last few years especially, this committee has been very focused on the issue, holding hearings in both this subcommittee as well as in the Oversight and Investigations, Mr. Stupak's subcommittee. And I want to thank Mr. Dingell as well as Chairman Waxman and Mr. Stupak for their commitment to this bill and for their tireless work on this issue. And it has been tireless for a long time. Now, obviously, we must do something to address our nation's food safety system. Too often it breaks down, too often contaminated or dangerous products make it onto grocery store shelves and into consumers' homes, and too often people get sick or even die due to unsafe food products. During our hearing last week, we heard about a 3-year-old who suffered kidney failure after eating contaminated spinach, a mother of young triplets who fell ill after eating contaminated baby food was in my office recently, and this needs to stop, and it needs to stop now. The bill before us today is based on a discussion draft that Chairman Waxman, Chairman Dingell, Mr. Stupak, and I released a few weeks ago. It includes provisions from Ms. DeGette's food recall and traceability bills and incorporates input from the FDA and key stakeholder groups. It also reflects some of the conversations we've had with Ranking Member Barton, Ranking Member Deal, and Mr. Shimkus. These conversations have been very productive, and we intend to continue meeting on the remaining outstanding issues after this morning and as we move to full committee markup. Our bill today focuses predominantly on prevention. Unlike the current system of reacting to a foodborne illness outbreak only after consumers have fallen ill, this bill will require that companies put in place preventive controls to monitor the production lines and identify, prevent, or eliminate hazards should they arise. It requires companies to have food safety plans detailing all the food safety activities the company is undertaking to ensure the safety of their products, and to make those food safety plans available to an FDA inspector upon inspection. The bill will also require all facilities that sell products in the United States to register annually with the FDA and to pay a registration fee. The bill also empowers the agencies with authorities that are crucial to the food safety system. Under the bill, the FDA will have the authority to set performance standards that companies must incorporate into their food safety plans. It requires the FDA to put in place a traceability system for food products so we can easily trace a contamination from the consumer all the way back to the source of contamination. It requires the FDA to inspect facilities according to a minimum inspection frequency, and it provides the FDA with enhanced enforcement authorities, including civil monetary penalties, recall, administrative detention, seizure, and subpoena. Now, I believe that this bill will reform and modernize our antiquated food system. I believe it will supply the FDA with the resources it needs to create a strong food safety agency, and it will provide the authorities the agency requires to set standards and identify hazards and dangerous contaminants. And finally, it will give the agency the enforcement authorities it needs to make sure that companies are complying with the bill and ensuring that the food they're making really is safe for consumers to eat. Again, I'd like to thank my colleagues for all your work on this issue. There's been an incredible amount of work on this issue for so many people on this committee, and I look forward to comments on this bill as we move forward. I'll now recognize Mr. Deal for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Pallone. I appreciate you holding the markup on H.R. 2749, the Food Safety Enhancement Act of 2009. I appreciate the fact that you and your staff have made the issue of food safety a priority for this subcommittee, and the fact that we've been able to work on a bipartisan basis, and hopefully we'll continue to do that as we address this significant issue. This committee has made tremendous progress in crafting a bipartisan bill over the last few weeks, but there are some significant improvements that have been made, but a few concerns that I have which remain. One of those, which is the most troublesome, I think, is one that we should address, and that is the level of civil monetary penalties for unintentional violations which do not result in harm. This bill would impose penalties up to $500,000 on a food facility for such a violation without any form of a cap. Therefore, due to an unintended and ultimately harmless violation of the law, fees in excess of millions of dollars could be imposed. This would decimate companies, particularly small businesses, as a result. It is only reasonable that this committee include reasonable, strict liability limits, as well as a limit on civil penalties per proceeding. And I hope that we can revisit this issue today and as we continue to move forward. I would also like to highlight my concern with the frequency of FDA inspections of food facilities. This legislation would require inspections of high-risk facilities every 6 to 8 months, low-risk facilities every 18 months to 3 years, and warehouse storage facilities every 3 to 4 years. Based upon input from stakeholders and the financial burden which this schedule would place on the FDA and the industry, I believe this inspection regimen may not be realistic. I agree that we must ensure that FDA conducts more thorough, efficient, and targeted inspections, and by working with my colleagues in the coming week, I hope we're able to arrive at an inspection schedule which is both cost-efficient and highly effective. I'm also concerned that requiring food facilities to maintain records in a standardized electronic format. I have a number of smaller-scale food facilities in my district and across the state of Georgia, many of which lack the sophisticated and costly computer infrastructure to enable electronic record keeping. This would pose a significant hardship on thousands of companies across the country, and I hope we can continue to work to avoid unintended consequences on this critical segment of the food industry. Again, I appreciate Chairman Pallone's willingness to mark up this legislation today, and I'd like to thank Chairman Waxman and Chairman Emeritus Dingell, as well as their staffs, for their tireless efforts on this front. I look forward to working with all of you in a spirit of bipartisanship as we craft this bill as it will go to the full committee. And I hope that it will be a bill that all of us can support. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Deal. Our Chairman Emeritus, Mr. Dingell, who's worked so hard on this bill for so many years. Thank you for all your work, Mr. Dingell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for this markup. It is time. This bill, as I have observed, is now old enough to vote, and I think it is therefore old enough for us to vote on. I want to observe that this is a piece of legislation which is an example of how the House should work and how members should get together in a bipartisan fashion. I want to thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for their work with us, and I want to commend my colleagues on the minority side for their assistance. We're considering a bill today, H.R. 2749, the Food Safety Enhancement Act of 2009. I'm proud to be the lead sponsor, but I want to thank my colleagues who have joined in co-sponsorship. Yourself for your assistance and that of Mr. Stupak, my dear friend from Michigan, and also Ms. DeGette. We started out a number of years ago on drafting legislation to fix food safety problems and also problems which exist with regard to safety of pharmaceuticals. After years of hard work and cooperation of and with our Republican colleagues, we have been able to produce a strong piece of legislation which is proceeding now in a bipartisan fashion. The legislation before us has enjoyed a number of titles and a number of different bill numbers. The goal has consistently remained the same, to provide FDA with the necessary authorities and resources to protect the nation's food supply. And I would observe that both Food and Drug and the nation's food supply are in some substantial disarray. We intend that that will be corrected, that FDA will get the resources and the authorities which it needs to conduct its business in protecting the American people. I want to thank Mr. Waxman for his early acknowledgement of the need for this legislation, and I wanted to thank also Mrs. Sutton for her help in this, with regard to this matter. I'd like to congratulate and thank two of my staff members, Mr. Virgil Miller and Ms. Katie Campbell, for their assistance, and your staff, Mr. Chairman, and that of the Republican side. I want to thank Mr. Barton for the way he's worked with us and Mr. Deal, and also to thank Mr. Shimkus, who has been helpful throughout the time that we have worked on this. You will observe that the good faith of all parties is to be reflected in the manager's amendment, which we will consider today. We have closed the gap on a number of important issues. A few, as observed by Mr. Deal, still remain. I look forward to continued discussions prior to the full committee markup with the goal of producing a bill that will be bipartisan in character and of which all members on both sides of the aisle may be proud. I am pleased to report we've been able to reach agreement on issues of great importance, which have been most contentious. One of them is the issue of fees. And in this, I want to discuss the behavior of GMA, the Grocery Manufacturers Association. They have been gentlemanly, cooperative, and decent throughout this process, and I want to express my appreciation to them for their assistance in this matter. They have served the public interest and the interest of their own people, and I hope that they are pleased with their efforts, because they indeed should be. I've always been convinced that it doesn't matter what new authorities we give the FDA, unless we give them resources to exercise these authorities and carry out their responsibilities. Industry, with regard to their historic opposition to fees, has accepted that they have an appropriate role in ensuring that FDA has adequate resources. And again, I want to express my appreciation to them. That role is detailed in today's manager's amendment, and it will enable everybody to prosper from this, including the consumers, the industry, and Food and Drug Administration. And it's my hope that the industry will get better service out of FDA because we are giving them the resources to arrive at better judgments more quickly. While food safety has garnered our immediate attention, I have to remind my colleagues that when we finish this, we still have the problem of FDA's oversight of drugs, devices, and cosmetics. We have legislation in the mill which is moving forward on all of these, and which will be necessary to pass if we intend to have Food and Drug be able to carry out its mission in proper fashion with regard to all of the things under its jurisdiction. The good news then is that we don't have to look far to find good legislation to address these issues. And we have an appropriate legislative response in the Food and Drug Administration Globalization Act. And I would observe again that I, along with you, Mr. Chairman, and our dear friend, Mr. Stupak, have introduced this legislation earlier this year. We have been engaged vigorously in this matter, and although occupied much in health reform over the past few months, we are getting this to the point where it is ready to make Food and Drug again the strong, vigorous, publicly oriented agency which I can remember a long time ago they used to be. The legislation here is not perfect. It's not perfect. We have work to do. Money has to be appropriated by the appropriators, who have been notoriously short in their effort. And I can comfortably say, however, that we have before us a better bill because of the contributions made by the members of this committee, both Democrats and Republicans, by consumer groups, by the FDA, by industry, and by other stakeholders. I urge my colleagues to support the legislation. We owe it to the American people. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Dingell. Our ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to say at the outset that after the opening statement, I've got to run over and do a press event, but I should be back for most of the markup. I want to thank you and Chairman Waxman and Chairman Dingell for working with us on today's issue. I said back in March that there really wasn't any daylight between Chairman Waxman and myself in terms of food safety, what we needed to accomplish. We've had a somewhat rocky road between then and now, but in the last week, the majority has worked, I think, very cooperative with the minority, and the result is a draft, a set of issues that we can work on today at subcommittee and continue to work on at full committee. Serious substantive progress has been made, and while I don't believe the manager's amendment today is the end result that's going to be the end-all be-all, it is a good starting point. One area where we've made great progress is resources for the FDA. I was concerned that in the early drafts the level of fees was excessive and would have squeezed both food producers and consumers. We all agree that the FDA needs more money for food safety, but we have disagreed on the level of funding that the FDA should receive. The fee language in the manager's amendment that's going to be offered today is a product of good faith negotiations, not just between the minority and the majority, but also between the Congress and the stakeholders. And I think progress has been made. This is a public health problem. I think the Congress has a responsibility to appropriate more funds for the FDA for food safety. It's still a debatable proposition, the exact level that should be fees and the level that should be appropriated through the appropriations process. But I do say that good faith has been exhibited on all sides, and we're making progress. Another issue in the draft that still needs some work is the section on civil monetary penalties. This draft would allow for the first time the FDA to impose civil penalties up to $500,000 on a food company for an unintentional violation that causes no harm. There is no per violation cap on these penalties, so it's theoretically possible that the FDA could impose this fine for each article of food involved. These fines, if imposed in that way, could easily run into the millions or tens of millions of dollars. I think we need reasonable limits for strict liability violations, as well as an overall per proceeding limit. If there are egregious violations and the FDA wants to impose a larger fine or a stronger penalty, the FDA already has the authority to go to court and prosecute the individual or the company either civilly or criminally. Giving FDA for the first time administrative authority to impose civil fines of this magnitude on food producers is a significant new authority, and we need to be very careful what we do here. More work will have to be done between subcommittee and full committee on this issue. Inspection frequency is another issue with the draft. We've heard a number of people testify before the committee that you can't inspect your way to food safety, but that's what this draft intends to try to do. It would require an inspection of high-risk facilities every 6 to 18 months, low-risk facilities every 18 months to 3 years, and warehouses every 3 to 4 years. These inspection frequencies are not feasible. Requiring the FDA to inspect low-risk facilities and warehouses at that frequency will not improve food safety. That's not just my opinion. That's the opinion of numerous people who've testified before this committee and numerous stakeholders that are concerned about this issue. FDA also, at last week's hearing, expressed some reservations about these frequencies. I think that we should provide, either in today's markup or at full committee, more flexibility in frequency inspection. Mr. Chairman, I've listed some of the problems I see with the draft, but I don't want to end on a bad note. I want to thank you, Mr. Pallone, Chairman Waxman, and Chairman Stupak of the Oversight Subcommittee. I'd also like to thank Mr. Walden, Mr. Deal, and several members on the Republican side for working together to make this draft and this markup possible today. I want to give special commendation to Chairman Dingell. He has worked like a Trojan on this in prior Congresses, and he continues to work in this Congress. I think it is one of his legacy issues that he will be remembered for, and he has been a total gentleman to me and the minority in reaching out to us both professionally and personally, and I want to give him special commendation for his efforts on this issue. With that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back and say that we look forward to this markup today.
Thank you, Mr. Barton. Chairman Waxman.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Deal, and all our members for the food safety reform bill that we have before us today. The legislation we're marking up represents a huge accomplishment for this committee. We stand on the verge of passing a comprehensive, broadly supported, and bipartisan reform of our nation's food safety laws. The committee released a discussion draft, held our first legislative hearing just 1 week ago. Over the last week, we've worked with members, Democratic and Republican, on and off the committee with consumer and food safety groups, and with numerous representatives from the food industry and with the Obama administration. We've made a great deal of progress. I know we still have some issues to work out, and I'm committed to working with the members of the committee to resolve them. My plan is to have a full committee markup next Wednesday, and I'm confident we'll have strong bipartisan consensus on tough new standards to protect the food supply. There's a lot to be proud of in this bill. It establishes a new preventive approach to avoiding foodborne illness. It requires that all facilities conduct hazard analyses, assess potential food safety risks, and develop plans to keep the food supply safe. It establishes FDA food safety standards for produce. It establishes a food traceback system so that FDA and public health officials can easily determine the causes of foodborne disease outbreaks and gives the agency new tools to keep the food supply safe. We're making a crucial breakthrough in this legislation by establishing a user fee system that provides dedicated funding for food safety activities. Under a proposal that we developed with the Republicans on our committee and with the Grocery Manufacturers Association, facilities will be assessed $500 annual registration fee. These fees will provide FDA with a much-needed infusion of resources to keep the food supply safe. Over the next week, I want to make this bill even better, and I'm confident that we can come to agreement on other key issues. I want to acknowledge how far we've come with this bill and thank those responsible. Chairman Emeritus Dingell has worked on these issues for years. His ideas have helped form the foundation of this bill, and he and his staff have played a critical role in the negotiations over the key provisions in this bill. Chairman Stupak's great work on the Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee has helped identify key gaps in the regulatory system, and he continues to be one of our strongest advocates for fixing these problems. Health Subcommittee Chairman Pallone has shown great leadership on this issue, and I appreciate his work on last week's hearing and this week's markup. I also want to acknowledge the work of Representative Sutton on the recall provisions of the bill and the work of Representative DeGette on the traceability provisions. Finally, I want to thank our Republican colleagues, Ranking Member Barton and Ranking Member Deal, and Representative Shimkus for their willingness to engage with us on this bill and for their ideas to help make it better. I'm looking forward to this. I'm looking forward to this markup and to continuing to work with you and other committee members as we move towards full committee markup of a strong bipartisan food safety reform bill next week. I want to thank those who have been involved, Mr. Dingell, Mr. Stupak, Mr. Deal, Mr. Barton, Mr. Pallone, Mr. Shimkus, and all the outside groups and all our colleagues who have played such an important role. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief. I'm too supposed to leave for a press conference, but it was important for me to say thanks to your side, to Chairman Waxman, Chairman Emeritus Dingell, yourself, Chairman Pallone, Chairman Stupak, and my colleagues for, first of all, having a good legislative hearing, then following that up with really good discussions. And so it's important for me to say that and say thanks. Both sides have come to agreement and compromise on many key issues, such as country and origin labeling, traceability, and fresh produce standards. I'm also encouraged by the progress we made on other big items, and I look forward to continuing to work in a bipartisan manner towards a full committee markup and settle the rest of these outstanding issues. Chief among those is the fees for both facilities and importers, civil monetary penalties, some of these were addressed earlier, the ability for change in the inspection regime for certain categories after review by the FDA, recall authority, and lastly, clarifying our intent isn't to duplicate or overregulate those already registered and follow strict safety standards such as meat and poultry farmers under the USDA or wine and spirits industries under the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Trade Bureau. So I look forward to working with you, and thank you for moving this forward. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Gordon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think Chairman Waxman has commended just about everybody here, and so I want to concur with him in really the accolades he gave to all the principals who've done a good job. Overall, I believe that we have a very good product here, and I'm encouraged with the bipartisan effort to improve the bill, and I hope these good efforts will continue between now and the full committee. Although I do still have some concerns, and I concur with some of Mr. Dill's earlier concerns. In particular, I believe it would be useful to further clarify what type of food facilities are covered by the registration fee and other requirements in the bill. I'm especially concerned that we may be inadvertently covering very small, often seasonal mom-and-pop food processors that make homemade food items. I think we all have numerous groups like this in our districts. So I would like to work with the committee to clarify this issue as we move forward with this legislation, and I yield back my time.
Thank you. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that the committee has worked so hard on this. Please forgive me if I don't share in the spirit of bipartisanship that is so much on display this morning, because I don't know, maybe it didn't filter down to the kids' table here on the minority side. But you know, we had the draft discussion last week, and then we had the discussion hearing last week, and then we had the draft legislation. Some significant problems with the draft legislation. Then less than a week later, we're back here with a markup, receiving a manager's amendment literally just hours ago. It has been tough to make sure that this thing does what we would all like for it to do. And it, you know, sometimes, Mr. Chairman, it almost seems like because we're Republicans that we can't intuit the real concerns of the food safety universe. But realistically, many of us have worked on this for years. Many of us have worked closely with your colleague, Mr. Costa from California. Many of us have worked with the legislation that would track Senator Kennedy's food safety bill over on the Senate side. So all of us, whether we're Democrats or Republicans, are aware of this and concerned with the country's food safety needs. I've felt for a long time that we need the ability to put an emergency stop button in our food imports so that when a foodborne illness issue arises on a Friday afternoon, we don't have to wait until Monday at 9 o'clock for someone to get out of his or her chair and make a decision. This is a common sense idea. It wasn't included in this bill. I've introduced standalone legislation to deal with this, and I intend to attempt to amend the bill later on today to include that. But, Mr. Chairman, it is tough to sit here on this committee and watch these news stories on Lou Dobbs where we're not doing our work because the salmonella that devastated the tomato industry in this country last year was actually a problem with peppers, and those were peppers coming across the southern border in Texas. And even after all of that was finally discerned, we waited until after the weekend before we actually acted. Other concerns in Section 107 regarding the traceability of food that would grant an exemption for food produced on a farm and then sold directly to a consumer or restaurant. These farms would never have to trace. How would this fix that problem that we had down in Texas with the contaminated peppers last summer? That was food that was sold directly from the farm to consumers on this side of the border, and it doesn't seem like this bill would actually have stopped that from happening. And even some of the president's concerns are not being addressed. President Obama's appointee to the Food and Drug Administration, the recently confirmed Dr. Hamburg, testified on Friday that it's going to be difficult for them to meet the inspection deadline in Section 105. So even if we were to push tons of money in appropriations, 18 months is not enough time for the Food and Drug Administration to hire, train, and implement the aggressive food inspection provisions of Section 105. This bill also was supposed to strip out all of the references to devices. This was just to be a foods bill, but references to food, drug, and device actually did appear in the discussion draft 14 times. Yes, 13 of those 14 were removed, but in Section 205, regarding the suspension of registration, which is a fairly significant enforcement action, we still have the importation of food, drugs, and devices as language in the bill for those who make an inaccurate or incomplete statement or submission of information. And then finally, Mr. Chairman, at 7:13 this morning, we received the manager's amendment, all 113 pages. I've gotten through about a third of it so far. You know, again, members need to be given the common courtesy of enough time to read and evaluate these very important pieces of legislation that we're trying to push through this committee. I'm optimistic because this is a subcommittee, Mark, and unlike other pieces of legislation that didn't go through regular order, there is the opportunity to amend and improve this legislation. I intend to work with the committee to do that, but I am concerned about some of the ways that this has come to us. I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Next is our subcommittee vice chair, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Capps.
In the interest of moving the bills, the bill before us, I pass on my opening statement and want to thank the authors and leaders of this good effort to move us forward in Food and Drug Administration.
Thank you. Gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Gingrey.
Mr. Chairman, a number of developments in recent years have highlighted potential gaps and failures in our food safety system, from E. coli contamination of California spinach to salmonella-tainted peanuts in Texas and my home state of Georgia. It's apparent that more needs to be done to protect the health and welfare of our citizens as it relates to the food we eat. The Bush administration issued several reports, studies in 2007 actually calling for a major overhaul of the system. President Obama, in his March 14, 2009 weekly radio address, called the food safety system, and I quote, a hazard to public health. It is against this backdrop of bipartisan concern that I commend the efforts of this committee's leadership, both Democratic and Republican, on their combined efforts to find a workable solution for the problems that currently plague our food oversight mechanisms. That being said, I would like to encourage my colleagues to continue their efforts on a few outstanding issues. First, I would like to see this committee draw more distinction between the oversight responsibilities of the FDA and USDA as they relate to food safety. Additionally, the bill addresses one area of breakdown in our food safety net that is essential for a safe food supply: facility inspection. In testimony given before this committee just last week, FDA's new commissioner, Dr. Hamburg, testified that more frequent inspections are needed, but we also need to do smarter inspections. I would like to encourage this committee to work together to create a smarter inspection schedule that focuses resources where they are most needed, instead of the inspection schedule that Dr. Hamburg admits is not attainable with the present resources within the FDA. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the willingness of this committee to work in a bipartisan fashion to improve the food safety system in this country. As most of us in this room know, our committee will soon be taking up the issue of health care reform. It's my sincere hope that we proceed with the same spirit of bipartisanship on that issue as the committee has shown here today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The other gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Barrow.
I thank the chairman. An issue that I've been concerned about is the reliability of ongoing testing. And testimony in our hearings have brought out the fact that both the sampling regime and the testing regime have to have integrity. We're not going to know what we need to know when we need to know it. I've been pushing and advocating throughout the process for some sort of mandatory reporting system so that the regulator knows what the processor knows when the processor knows it. A competing consideration, though, is not give the processors an incentive not to know what they need to know when they need to know it. You don't want to give folks an incentive to dumb down the process and not test for fear they'd have to disclose some positives that they'd rather not disclose. So it seems to me we have to weigh these two things in the balance. I've been working with the chairman emeritus and with the subcommittee staff and with the committee staff to try and bring into harmony a proposal that would balance these two competing considerations so that we can have the twin goals of having the processor know what the processor knows when they need to know it, and for the regulator to know that as well in real time. I think that would provide a tremendous incentive toward better standards and best practices, and I'm going to continue to work with that. Hopefully we'll have something to add to the bill in the markup for the full committee. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'd like to thank you and your staff for removing the provisions in the discussion draft which applied to drugs and devices. Drug and device safety issues should be addressed, just not in a bill dedicated to food safety. and I understand the committee plans to take up those issues later this year. I'm still concerned, however, with the risk-based inspection schedule in Section 105. The bill requires that Category 1, high-risk, facilities be inspected at least every 6 to 18 months. Category 2, low-risk, facilities be inspected at least every 18 months to 3 years. And Category 3 facilities, those that hold food, such as warehouses, be inspected at least every 3 to 4 years. On the domestic side, it is estimated that there are 30,000 high-risk facilities, 45,000 low-risk facilities, and 72,000 warehouses. And we do not even have a good estimate of the number of foreign facilities. The sheer cost and manpower required to meet this inspection schedule is staggering, and FDA is neither adequately funded nor staffed to undertake such a responsibility. It is my understanding that staff on both sides of the aisle have been discussing ways to adjust the inspection schedule while still ensuring that the nation's food supply is safe. The bill does require FDA to make recommendations to Congress on adjustments to the timing of the schedule 3 years after enactment, but I believe we can make those changes here in committee. Our side has offered a schedule that requires the high-risk facilities be inspected every year, low-risk facilities be inspected every 3 years, once every 3 years, and warehouses be inspected once every 5 years. I would urge the majority to work with us on this matter and accept these common sense adjustments. And thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Christensen.
Thank you, Chairman Pallone and Ranking Member Deal, and thank you for bringing these important pieces of legislation together under the Dingell bill and bringing it so early in the session to markup. This legislation, which will strengthen the protections of our food supply, is one of several that are needed to reform a broken and deficient system that currently does not adequately protect the public health. In the case of food safety, we've heard the tragic stories. Many have been made ill because of the deficits in the system, and some have tragically died. The bill follows on several of the distressing hearings that we've had and does address many of the areas that we found were deficient and which allowed tainted food into our food supply, companies to continue to distribute that food with impunity, and Safe Foods and their suppliers to suffer severe economic damage because we could not trace the culprit in a timely and accurate manner. The Food Safety Enhancement Act of 2009, in that bill, FDA is not only required to do more frequent inspections on a risk-based criteria and provided with improved traceability and given stronger and necessary authority to order a recall, but also through fees get additional funding to support these activities. And I'm not sure if I read it correctly, but I think that I noted that lab test results now from accredited and independent laboratories would automatically be forwarded to FDA, which is a concern that, like Congressman Barrow, I raised at several hearings because I feel it's important for early notification of positive results and therefore early timely action, which can save individuals from illness and also save lives. So I thank you for holding this markup on this important legislation, and I want to especially thank Chairman Emeritus Dingell for his bold, relentless, and long championing of this legislation to improve this weak link in the chain that is our nation's public health system. And I look forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Deal, and our committee leadership and our colleagues to make yet this other step towards a stronger, more responsive FDA and a stronger national public health system. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Whitfield.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to waive my opening statement.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Colorado, Ms. DeGette.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Not to sound like a broken record, but we have had 11 hearings between O&I and this committee in the past 2 Congresses. And at the last Congress, we promised the families of those children who were poisoned by the tainted food that we would pass this legislation. I'm so proud of you. I'm so proud of Mr. Dingell. I'm so proud of our friends on the other side of the aisle for really hunkering down and for getting this bill done. It almost seems effortless now that we get to this day, but the years and the years that we've been working on these food safety issues are finally coming to fruition, and everybody's been working together to make this happen. I want to specifically point to a couple of parts of the bill that I've had involvement in for a number of years. The first one is giving the FDA mandatory recall authority. People are shocked to learn that whenever tainted food is recalled in our country, it's on a voluntary basis. And oftentimes, particularly when we have less than savory operators, it takes a long time to find the proof and to recall that food. So while I hope that the other provisions of the bill work to make sure that we don't have to recall food because it will be safe in the first place, the fact is the FDA needs to have the ability to recall tainted food when all else fails, and this bill will give them that opportunity. The second issue, and one that's proved to be a little more difficult and thorny, is the traceability provision. But again, this aspect is critical to being able to track down tainted food and to recall it in a speedy manner so that both the public health is preserved, but also so the profits of the food companies are preserved. Rather than having these overbroad recalls that devastate whole industries, we'll now be able to pinpoint with accuracy where the food came from and remove it from the market. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you. I want to thank Mr. Dingell. I want to thank our colleagues on the other side of the aisle. I want to thank the food industry. And I want to thank the consumer product advocates for working together on the traceability language. It's far-reaching. It's going to mean a whole new level of detail in the food industry, but it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do for the consumers of America, and I think everybody has worked together to really make this happen. And so it's a great day for the U.S. Congress. And I also want to thank Mr. Stupak in absentia for helping. He's not here right now, but he has been tireless in exploring these things and finding out the loopholes. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Myrick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will yield, but I did want to say thanks to you and Mr. Dingell and everyone who worked together to get this bill forward.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Sutton.
Thank you, Chairman Pallone, for holding this markup on this extremely important legislation, which I'm proud to be one of the sponsors of. I want to thank Chairman Emeritus Dingell for all of his work through the years and bringing this to fruition in this comprehensive bill. I also want to thank Chairman Waxman and Chairman Stupak and Congresswoman DeGette for their tireless efforts in making sure that the food on our tables is safe to eat. You know, unfortunately, the headlines over foodborne illnesses remain front and center in our national press, and we've seen far too many outbreaks of foodborne illnesses originating in everything from spinach, beef, peanuts, alfalfa, sprouts, and the list goes on. And those outbreaks continue to highlight the vulnerability of our food supply and the need for the safety reform legislation that we have before us. The issue of food safety and foodborne illness has taken a disproportionate toll on my home state of Ohio. Over the past year, there have been 105 cases of salmonella infection reported in Ohio, and sadly, 3 deaths from the most recent peanut-based strain. Nellie Napier, a constituent of mine, died from salmonella poisoning, which she contracted at a nursing home facility. And in April of this year, in Cuyahoga County to the north of me, there were 3 incidents of illness from E. coli and another death, this time a 7-year-old girl. And we know it's our obligation to protect our most vulnerable populations. Congress must ensure that the FDA is doing all that it can to protect our families and ensure our food safety. I'm proud that the Protect Consumers Act, which I introduced earlier this year in the last session of Congress to give the FDA mandatory recall authority when we learn that food is unsafe to eat, has been included in this bill. I greatly appreciate that it has been made a part of this legislation. Americans need to know that the food on their family's table and in their children's lunch boxes are safe to eat. Whether the food is grown here or imported from abroad, there must be strict regulation of the supply line that feeds our nation. And I'm pleased that this bill seeks to improve the safety of food imports. Now, we heard in our hearing last week that close to 13% of the food we eat comes from abroad, and yet the FDA inspects less than 1% of the food shipments arriving at our ports. This dynamic needs to change, and the certification provisions in the bill we are discussing today will help to do that. I'm looking forward to the eventual passage of this bill, as it is a necessary first step in securing our country's food safety. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to working with you and Chairman Emeritus Dingell and Chairman Waxman and all of the members of the committee to continue to reform our food inspection system and ensure the safety of our food supply. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for the legislation today, and I'm glad that we are at the markup, and I still have concerns about this legislation and how it increases the FDA authority and will make it one of the largest agencies, the largest federal agencies in existence. And in my opinion, we still have too little oversight and too little accountability that come from this committee. The FDA, as we know, is saddled with so many mandates, and the newest is tobacco regulation, and I do feel and continue to feel that is going to place stress on what I see as a broken federal bureaucracy. As I've said in the past, the FDA needs to shift its focus from reacting to food safety breaches and instead implement policies to prevent those problems before they occur. I think everyone knows that we're not going to inspect our way to food safety. We have to be proactive. I do remain concerned about the burdens this legislation is going to place on businesses, but particularly those small businesses. And a couple of my colleagues have mentioned that already this morning. I'm very concerned about the impact that is going to have on some of our small businesses with regards to inspections, fees, access to records, traceability, and some of the other provisions. I believe that companies large and small put food safety at the top of their list. It's a concern for them through quality controls to achieve the highest standards and assess risks. These companies are committed to preventative measures that produce safe products the first time, not after the fact. And I would like to see the final draft of this legislation move more that direction. But again, I thank the chairman and both the majority and the minority for working hard to produce an improved bipartisan food safety bill, and I yield back my time.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from California, Ms. Harmon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to observe that this markup and the hearings that preceded it demonstrate why following the regular order matters. This bill is much better because of the many hearings we've held, and I think it will be even better following this markup as new issues are brought to the table. And I commend you and I commend others on both sides of the aisle for working seriously to make it the best bill we can field. Nobody's arguing about the need to regulate food safety better. Coming from California, which has the largest ag industry in the country, we have, as many other states have, suffered from outbreaks of E. coli, problems with pistachios and other things. But I want to say that some things in this bill, like a risk-based system, are, in my view, the right way to go. And I don't know that we would have come to that if we hadn't had the careful review that we have. I also commend the sections on lab testing, very important to the ports of L.A. and Long Beach, adjacent to my district, and the section, subtitle B, on intervention, which will help us create a food safety surveillance system that really works for the whole country. All of these things matter. Let me just highlight one issue that I know will merit further consideration by the committee as the bill moves forward, and that is an issue that has been raised with me, and I know Chairman Waxman and perhaps others, by customs brokers who are a major factor in my district. They say that the new reporting requirements on importers should not directly apply to them because they are essentially performing a different role. And there is a detailed letter to Chairman Waxman about this, which I would like unanimous consent to insert in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. And I just want to close with a comment that that their interests and the interests of others who are now engaged in this fight matter. And I am quite confident that they will be heard and that if adjustments are needed in the legislation, they will be fully considered. So I want to thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and thank all the members of the subcommittee for doing the job we were elected to do, which is paying a lot of attention to serious legislation in our subcommittee and committee. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman from Indiana wish to make an opening? No? The gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me add my voice to all the people of congratulations to all the people who have been responsible for bringing this bill to us in a expedited way, and the work that has been done on both sides of the aisle. It's, I think, the best of the way that Congress works. This issue is a very personal one for me. My good friend Nancy Donnelly lost her son Alex in 1993 after he ate ground beef contaminated with E. coli. And I've been working on food safety, well, it's heading into about 40 years. Stories like Nancy's are obviously heard too often in this chamber. That's been mentioned over and over again. And finally, we have a serious proposal that will overhaul and improve the FDA's food safety initiatives. First and foremost, the mandatory recall authority is so incredibly important. Companies can't then refuse to recall products that could be harmful or deadly to consumers. And unbelievably, there was at least one company that refused to recall their products that were linked to the Peanut Corporation of America's nationwide outbreak of Salmonella. Second, it requires all food facilities to implement safety plans, common sense measure that will help prevent problems before they happen. Third, it increases inspections of food facilities. Studies have shown that the American people support thorough and frequent inspections of places where their food comes from, and having a minimum inspection standard and a risk-based inspection standard is critical to preventing the type of outbreaks we've seen. And finally, it improves our ability to trace where food comes from, identifying the source of an outbreak, tracing it to any of the possible destinations will help identify problem companies and also protect those companies that aren't the problem companies. There are a couple of things that I would hope we could still add to the bill. One critical component that I believe needs to be included in the final bill is a requirement that companies that have positive test results for dangerous pathogens must report those findings to the Food and Drug Administration. And I know this is an issue that's been brought up. Hopefully we're continuing to work on it, and that we'll have some new language in the legislation. The other has to do with having the FDA consider the extent to which prolific antibiotic use in livestock is contributing to increased antibiotic resistance. There is a sentence in the legislation that refers to that, but I'm hoping that we could bolster it even more. I do have to say that overall I'm pleased with the product before us and look forward to working with the chairman and other members on both sides of the aisle to continue to strengthen this very good bill. And I thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlewoman from California, Ms. Eshoo.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this markup. And I want to also join the rest of my colleagues in congratulating and thanking those that have been so persistent and dogged in pursuing the reforms that really need to be brought to our food safety system, which I think is in tatters in our country, and the record obviously shows it. To the consumer groups that have worked so hard on this for so long, and the families, you are the ones that have never really given up. And I think if I were going to give credit the bulk of the credit would go to you for your advocacy. This has been a long, winding road to today's markup. I recall at least a decade ago introducing in the, well, a decade ago, what Congress was that? Sweeping legislation to address the shortcomings in our food safety system. Dick Durbin, who was our House colleague, had just gone over to the Senate, and I remember sitting up one night and listening to a C-SPAN hearing of the Senate, and there was testimony from inspectors that had actually been paid off to allow less than safe foods coming into our country. And he introduced a bill in the Senate, I introduced a bill in the House, carried that bill for 2 Congresses, and no one was interested in it. The Republicans weren't, the National Grocers Association were in real opposition to it, and the Democrats were not interested either, most frankly. But it took recalls, it took people becoming critically ill and people dying to get the Congress to actually move. And which reminds me that we are a reactive organization instead of proactive. But whatever it is, this is a very important day because what people ingest, they have a right to expect that it is safe. The United States of America should be the gold standard in food safety regulation. I would have preferred to have seen just a food safety agency in our country. I worry that the fees that are going to be levied are certainly not going to meet what the cost of the entire undertaking is. If we fall short in appropriations, then different parts of the bill, I think, will be mandates, but they won't be able to be carried out. I think the FDA is heavily burdened with critical responsibilities today, but that's not the direction of this bill, and I want to see progress made on this front because it really has come to the point where it's a life and death situation for American citizens, and that cannot be tolerated. So I look forward to this markup. I thank those that have worked on it, most especially the families and the consumer advocates. You have my great admiration and gratitude, and I think the entire committees as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have asked unanimous consent to have my full statement placed in the record.
Without objections, so ordered.
I know we need to start voting. I'm glad the bill's here. As my colleagues have said, it's been many hearings, and both on the Health Subcommittee and the O&I Subcommittee, and I'm glad we have this legislation before us on Food Safety Enhancement Act. I support it greatly. I still have some concern about the FDA labs that I expressed during our legislative hearing and actually for a few months last year. And I look forward to working with both the FDA and also our committee to make sure we can fund those labs if we can't, if we're not able to get the private sector to do what we need to do in the inspections. And with that, I yield back my time.
Thank you. Mr. Matheson from Utah.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an important piece of legislation. I'm pleased to see that we are moving forward. I understand the manager's amendment that was released earlier this morning does resolve a number of issues that various folks have been raising. I'd like to just raise a couple of issues that I'd like to see if we can work on as we move through subcommittee to full committee and the floor that I think would be helpful and enhance the bill. One is an issue that I raised during hearings in the last Congress about the issue of lead in ceramic plates. I would have thought this was a consumer product and not an FDA issue, but I found out I found out about this through a story back home where a young mother had a baby who had gotten quite sick. When they brought the baby into to be checked, they discovered the baby had lead poisoning, and it was determined that the mother was using ceramic plates in her microwave and heating her food on that, and then when the mother would nurse the baby, the lead would transfer to the baby. Turns out that this is a problem with a lot of ceramic ware. And it turns out that when ceramic ware is imported from other countries, it has an FDA stamp on the box because we had a testing situation, our county health departments back home, to look at these boxes, and you'd pull brand new plates out of these boxes with an FDA stamp on them, and you could test them and see that they had inappropriate levels of lead. Now, when you see a government stamp, that's supposed to mean something, but in this case, I'm not sure it means enough. And so if we could work on this as we go forward, Mr. Chairman, maybe at least a labeling requirement to inform consumers the product may contain lead, I think that would be a helpful step in terms of giving consumers better information to make good decisions, because there are ceramic products out there that are specifically labeled as lead-free. But the ones that do have lead don't say they may have lead. So that's an issue I just wanted to raise with you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to work with you as we move forward in this process. Let me mention just two other quick ones, because I know you want to get to voting. It's my understanding in this legislation that there's a call for where the FDA is going to be allowed to prescribe controls for entire produce categories. I think we need to understand the implications of that. I'm not sure exactly what they are, but I think that we ought to make sure we understand all the implications as we move forward on this. Finally, I want to raise quickly the issue of antibiotic resistance. I recently introduced legislation to address antibiotic resistance. It's called the STAR Act, H.R. 2400. And I've worked with the committee to include portions of that bill in other legislation. And there may be an opportunity in this food safety legislation to consider some of those provisions. So again, I'd like to engage with you in a dialogue as we move forward. With that, again, Mr. Chairman, thanks for our work on this. It's a really important issue, and I'll yield back my time.
Thank you. Gentlewoman from Wisconsin, Ms. Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for marking up this critically important bill this morning. And I want to commend you, as well as Chairman Emeritus Dingell and Chairman Stupak, for putting together this legislation reflecting so much hard work over the years. Stakeholders from every sector involved in this issue, from industry to consumer groups, have commended your work to strengthen the FDA's ability to improve the safety of our food. At our hearing last week, I mentioned an issue of concern to me regarding coordination between the federal government and the states. The legislation we are considering creates a risk-based inspection system for food facilities and also authorizes the Secretary of HHS to recognize state agencies as meeting the standards established for conducting inspections. I asked at the hearing the FDA how they plan to coordinate with states, and in their response, the FDA cited its 30 years of experience working with states through existing programs, but they did not acknowledge any plans to provide funding to states. Yet I will note that the fiscal year 2010 budget justification that the FDA submitted to the Appropriations Committee, in that they stated their desire to expand state capacity to perform risk-based inspections by increasing the number of cooperative agreements and partnerships with states. I'm hoping to work with you, Mr. Chairman, to ensure that states receive the support that they need to continue the excellent work they do on the ground. My state of Wisconsin licenses and inspects over 30,000 food businesses and regulates many other aspects of the food chain, from land to consumer. Nationwide, state and local governments perform over 90% of all food safety inspections, food sampling and food testing in the United States, over 2.5 million inspections each year. I want to ensure that food facilities are receiving the rigorous inspections they need to prevent contamination and disease, but I want to make sure that we are spending our money wisely and not duplicating our efforts. Last week, I also expressed my desire to make sure that this legislation does not prevent some of the most experienced and savvy laboratories from maintaining their partnership with the FDA. I also asked the FDA to clarify the record on this issue. They responded that a third-party laboratory that is not directly owned by a processor would be considered independent of that food processor for certain purposes. And I just want to make sure that as we move forward that this manager's amendment has that, will reflect that same interpretation. I really appreciate working with you and your staff to address these concerns to perfect an otherwise very strong and long overdue bill. And once again, I congratulate you on your work on this legislation and appreciate your hearing my comments.
Thank you. Gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Braley.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for considering the Food Safety Enhancement Act today. I'm glad to see that the subcommittee is marking up such important legislation to keep American families safe. I support this bill because it will correct many of the FDA's current limitations, and I'm pleased that the bill requires increased inspections of food facilities. I'm glad that the bill differentiates between high-risk facilities, low-risk facilities, and warehouses, and I'm also pleased to see provisions to ensure the safety of imported foods, reflecting concerns I raised in a bill I introduced last Congress, the Fresh Produce Safety Act, a bill that was brought about by a trip I took to our border inspection facilities at Nogales, Arizona, and Mexico, where 2/3 of produce sold in the United States and Canada during the winter growing season comes through. Today's bill has many other strong provisions, such as the whistleblower protection section, and I believe the bill is a big step forward in keeping America's food supply safe. I also appreciate the committee's willingness to listen to my concerns during consideration of this bill, especially on Section 201 related to our treatment of carbon monoxide in food packaging. The committee has been very responsive to concerns related to this provision, and I am hopeful that we can continue to work together on this and consider ways to give the FDA authority to determine how carbon monoxide should be treated. I also want to make sure that there is coordination among all government agencies involving food tracing, and that we don't create duplicative requirements, especially on farmers. This bill establishes a food tracing system which the Secretary will create, and it requires a pilot program to test the system, as well as multiple opportunities for public comment. I support these provisions to include the public as the system is developed, and I look forward to ensuring that the Secretary is taking into consideration the current requirements of other agencies throughout implementation. The Food Safety Enhancement Act will take significant steps toward ensuring the safety of the food we eat. We should be focused on preventing problems before they start, and this bill will help us do that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, and I believe that concludes our opening statements by the members, so we'll now begin consideration of the bill. The Chair now calls up H.R. 2749, the Food Safety Enhancement Act of 2009, and the clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 2749, a bill to amend the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to improve the safety of food in the global market and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. Bill is now considered as read, and without objection, the bill will be open to amendment at any point, and the Chair now recognizes himself to offer a manager's amendment to H.R. 2749 in the form of an amendment in the nature of a substitute, and the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of an amendment amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2749 offered by Mr. Pallone of New Jersey.
Without objection, the manager's amendment will be considered as read in original text for the purpose of amendment, and I'll recognize myself for a statement on the amendment in the nature of a substitute at this time. This is a bipartisan amendment that takes into account suggestions by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, input from stakeholders, as well as some smaller, more technical changes. And I'm pleased that we have been able to work in this fashion and that we've come to an agreement on the issues contained in this amendment. I do recognize, however, that there are a number of outstanding issues that we have not yet addressed. Some of the members mentioned those in their opening statements, and I hope that we will continue to work in a bipartisan fashion on those issues as we move to full committee markup, as Mr. Waxman has said, next week. I also want to mention that there are a number of questions from our hearing last week that have not yet been answered by our panelists. We hope to get those answers to the members who requested them as soon as possible, and with ample time left before the full committee markup next week. This amendment addresses a number of smaller, more technical issues, but I do want to highlight 4 changes that I feel are very important. The first pertains to the fees put forth by the bill as introduced. After conversations with members on both sides of the aisle, as well as long conversations with the key stakeholder groups, we've reduced the fee amount by half, changing it from $1,000 per facility to $500 per facility. We have included a cap on the fees so that no one organization will have to pay more than $175,000 per year. And finally, in response to some concerns we heard during the hearing last week on how the revenue generated from fees would be allocated, we changed the fee section to include a consultation in the form of a public meeting so that stakeholders will be able to weigh in on how the fee revenue will actually be spent. Now, the second change puts in place due process protections as to who at the FDA can exercise select enforcement authorities. This, too, is in response to concerns raised that these authorities should only be used in specific situations and that the decision to exercise them should be limited to certain individuals. We also clarified the traceability language to make clear that before the FDA can issue a regulation on a traceback system, they must take into account the views of the stakeholders, the information gathered in the information gathering period, as well as the results from the pilot study on traceability. And finally, we have included language that would allow the FDA to make accommodations for small businesses. In the preventive control sections, we added language that directs the Secretary to take into account small businesses when issuing guidance or regulations on preventive controls, and also to issue guidance specifically for small businesses on how to implement preventive controls in accordance with the bill. This is in addition to the already existing longer implementation period for small businesses, and we added similar language in the fresh produce standards section where we direct the Secretary to consider the impact of standards requirements on small farms. In sum, this bipartisan amendment addresses many of the concerns we heard from members on this committee as well as from stakeholders. Again, it has not addressed all the issues that we're working on, and we hope to continue this very productive process with our minority colleagues as we move forward with the bill next week. I support this amendment, and I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to do so, and I want to thank everyone for all the cooperation we received on this. Now, does any member seek recognition to offer, well, let me say, does any other member would like to speak on the manager's amendment? Gentleman from Kentucky.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I just, for clarification purposes, would like to ask just a couple of questions to legal counsel, if I could.
Sure.
As you know, in the rural areas, we have a lot of small grocery stores, convenience stores, and the first question I want to ask you, will all retailers be subject to mandatory recalls?
Counsel?
What? 417. Mr. Whitfield, your question refers to recall, the recall authority granted to FDA under Section 111
yes.
of the legislation. And your question was?
Does it apply to all retailers?
The authority under Section 111 refers to responsible parties as defined by the Act, and which is also as defined in the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and is also amended by the legislation that we're considering this morning. Amending this morning under Section 112 of the legislation before us, and responsible party as amended by the legislation before us is defined as a person who owns, operates, or is an agent of a restaurant or other retail food establishment. So yes, retailers are covered under this.
So convenience stores, whatever. Okay. Now, second question. In Section 112, it certainly makes these retailers subject to the food registry, which means that they will be required to contact the FDA if they become aware of a so-called reportable food, which is defined in the Act. And I was just wondering, maybe this pertains to regulations established by FDA, but trying to contact the FDA and report problem foods, is there anything in the language of the bill that requires the FDA to have a 800 number for reporting purposes?
There's nothing in the legislation to that effect.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Does any other member seek to address the manager's amendment? Gentleman from anybody? Gentleman from Indiana?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Well, before we proceed, let me just see if anyone else wants to address the manager's amendment.
Mr.
Yes.
Chairman.
Yes.
I seek recognition for strike
Mr. Chairman.
Words. I'll be very brief. I'd just like to say, Mr. Chairman, that this manager's amendment represents some very careful work by the staff to try and accommodate concerns set forth by my Republican colleagues. And I would note that we intend to continue working on those matters so that we can get this to be a bipartisan bill in which all of us are satisfied. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Chairman Dingell. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Burgess.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I just had a question for council, too, if I could.
Proceed, sure.
On the Section 107, under Section 107, farms will be excluded from the traceability requirements if they sell directly to the consumer. Now, are there any parameters drawn around the size of the farm or the nature of the consumer as far as the traceability requirements under the bill? For example, could ConAgra sell 100,000 pounds of tomatoes to one of the school districts, where that is a farm selling directly to the consumer? And would that be exempt from the traceability requirements?
Your question was, are there any parameters around the size of the farm as it relates to this?
Correct. Are there any definitions there that I'm missing? And I apologize because I don't have the correct page. I just got the new manager's amendment, the copy that I had last night. This was on page 46, and it addresses direct sales by farms. And it says food is exempt from this requirement of this subsection if the food is, 1, produced on a farm, 2, sold by the operator, owner, or agent in charge of such a farm directly to the consumer or restaurant or grocery store. So, in other words, could ConAgra, a huge farm, sell 100,000 pounds of tomatoes to the Denton Independent School District back home?
There is no specific language in the legislation that addresses the size of a farm.
So that would be exempt from the traceability requirements?
That. What are you referencing?
That sale, those tomatoes, that 100,000 pounds of tomatoes would be exempt from the traceability requirements?
Yes.
And again,
what was your question again, Mr. Burgess? If in the example that you provided?
Well, under Section 107, farms will be excluded if they sell directly to the consumer. But we really don't draw any parameters on, I mean, and intuitively, I think of a small farm that's selling at the farmer's market back home on Saturday morning. But that's a concept, but what about the other concept? A large industrial farm that is selling massive amounts of produce to a large consumer like a school district, hospital. Where is the traceability requirement for that really what would be a very large commercial sale?
Under the legislation, the exemption that you are referencing only states that food is exempt from the requirements if such food is produced on a farm and sold by the owner, operator, or agent in charge of such farm directly to a consumer or to a restaurant or grocery store. There is no additional language related in the legislation related to the actual size of the farm.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I would just point out, and I'm not certain if this represents a vulnerability in the bill, but I would respectfully ask that we work on this between now and the full committee markup and see if we cannot refine this definition, because it seems like that's a pretty large gap.
Will the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield.
I agree we should look at the language, because the intention of this language is to really address farmers markets that are dealing small producers in farmers markets and so on. And you're right, if there's a large corporate entity that's selling to another large corporate entity directly, we don't want this to be too broad of a loophole. So we certainly will be happy to work with the gentleman. I appreciate you raising.
Gentleman yield.
I'll be happy to
Mr.
yield.
Waxman.
Thank you for yielding to me. When there are multiple steps, that's where the traceability becomes important. Where there's only one step, farmer to the consumer directly, that there's an exemption. I think that was the policy behind this, but I think we ought to look at it and rethink this in any way you think appropriate between now and the full committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the consideration. I'll yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Texas. Unless anyone else wants to comment on the substitute, I'm going to move
Chairman?
to amendments. Mr. Boyer?
I just have one question of council, if I may.
Sure.
I wanted to, on the issue on full pedigree, so to council, with regard to retailers in section 107, will retailers be subject to full pedigree traceability requirements of section 107? Is this all retailers?
In section 107 of the legislation, on page 46, there is a specific reference to food that relates to restaurants and grocery stores. And the language specifically says that they shall keep records documenting the farm that was the source of the food. So that's the only records that they would be required to maintain.
Will, on the issues on quarantines to council, will retailers be subject to quarantine?
Would the gentleman yield to me?
Sure.
Mr.
I think
Bingham.
we have here, I'd like to kind of explain how this works here. First of all, direct sales by farms are not subject to some of the traceability requirements. But if you follow on down, you will find that that exemption is, first of all, applicable only to the foods produced on a farm. Second, sold by the owner, operator, or agent in charge of such farm directly to a consumer or to a restaurant or grocery store. If you come over to the top of page 47, you will see then restaurants and grocery stores. For food covered by an exemption under subparagraph A, restaurants and grocery stores shall keep records documenting the farm that was the source of the food. So you have a way in which you are tracing this. It is different. It is intended not to burden the farmer, but at the same time to see to it that you get the results you want, which is traceability of the food. And I thank the gentleman for yielding.
I thank you. With regard to the issue on quarantines and its impact upon retailers, to council?
Yes.
It is meant to apply also to retail of any size.
Under section 133, there is no language that relates to exemptions for retailers. The quarantine authority under this section relates to geographic areas.
All right. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. We'll proceed now to amendments, and the gentleman from India had an amendment. I recognize the gentleman.
Thank you very much. The amendment would be Booyer number 23.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of substitute to H.R. 2749, offered by Mr. Booyer.
I ask for consent that the amendment be read.
So ordered. The amendment is being distributed and without objection will be considered as read, and I'll recognize the gentleman to comment on his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I believe there is strong support from both sides of the aisle here in this committee to ensure that alcohol regulations remain under the jurisdiction of the Tax and Trade Bureau. The FDA, in answers to questions that I had submitted to them, the FDA supports TTB's continued regulation of alcoholic beverages as set forth under the MOU between FDA and ATF. As stated in the 1987 MOU, both agencies have authority with regard to alcoholic beverages. Pursuant to the Federal Alcohol Administration Act, FAA Act, and the Internal Revenue Code of 1986, TTB has authority over distilled spirits, wines, and malt beverages products, both domestic and imported. Currently, TTB ensures that alcoholic beverages are produced, advertised, and marketed in accordance with federal law. TTB also is charged with reviewing applications, ensuring permits for distilled spirits and wine operations regarding the production, packaging, and storage of alcohol, and ensuring that the labeling and advertising of alcoholic beverages are not misleading and that they provide adequate information to the consumer. In order to ensure that imported alcohol products are safe from contamination, TTB conducts background checks and looks at each potential importer's financial standing, trade connections, and business experience to decide whether or not the importer is likely to comply with federal law. Additionally, TTB requires, quote, certificates of label approval for every alcoholic beverage before it can be removed from customs custody or into domestic commerce, end quote. The TTB also requires pre-imported samples and routine market basket testing, where TTB investigators pull product samples from all levels of the distribution chain and send it to their labs to verify that the product is authentic and safe. TTB has a strong and extensive hold on the regulation of alcoholic beverage industry, collecting approximately $7 billion in alcohol excise taxes every year. The FDA stated in response to my question that it supports, as I said, the MOU between the FDA and ATF. FDA further stated that we believe there is no reason the draft legislation should alter the current regulatory framework. They also believe that it doesn't. It's important to note that TTB works closely with other federal agencies to ensure the safety of alcoholic beverages. These agencies include Customs and Border Protection to ensure the safety of imported alcoholic beverages, the FDA to seek advice on health and safety issues, and the USDA when alcohol products bear an organic claim on their labeling, and the U.S. Trade Representative when trade issues arise, and the Federal Trade Commission regarding alcohol advertising. Additionally, TTB works with state agencies and has memorandums of understanding with foreign countries. For this reason, I believe that TTB should continue to operate as the primary regulator of alcoholic beverages, and I believe there is strong support on this committee for that to remain in place. This is a classic, if it's not broken, don't break it. So I believe that this is an agency that has an excellent track record, Mr. Chairman, with working with many different agencies to protect the American people, and I believe that breaking this paradigm could cause a situation whereby we would be multiplicious and redundant. My amendment is supported by, obviously, brewers, distillers, and wine and beer and wine wholesalers. That should be no surprise. But I think this is an amendment, Mr. Chairman. I'm hopeful that you'll give it strong consideration, and I yield back my time.
Mr. Chairman?
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Chairman Dingell.
You'd like to strike the requisite number of words.
Recognize the chairman.
And I thank you for your courtesy, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to direct my comments to the author of the amendment. tell my good friend that he's referred to the Memorandum of Understanding between FDA and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF, under which ATF takes the lead on enforcement and regulations with assistance from FDA. In other words, FDA does harm assessments. This is something which has worked very well over the years, and the amendment here seeks to expressly exempt alcohol from requirements of the bill. In most instances, Food and Drug doesn't really have to be involved with regard to the question of safety. But I think the Memorandum of Understanding makes the amendment unnecessary. And truthfully, we don't know what the amendment exactly means. I will note to my good friend that it's never been the intent to interfere with the way that alcohol is currently regulated. And I would assure the gentleman that, in my opinion, this legislation, in view of the Memorandum of Understanding, does not. Now, the previous amendments to FFDCA have not included such language. So the amendment here, I'm afraid, would be causing us some problems with how it would be interpreted and how the courts or how the regulatory agencies would ultimately have their thoughts and actions interpreted, and what we would finally wind up with affecting us as the matter goes forward. And again, I would repeat to my friend that there's really, in my view, no need to exempt the provisions of the Federal Food and Drug Cosmetics Act when there is no such exemption in other provisions of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. This committee has dealt with this question in other instances, and we did it when we addressed the question of sulfites and sulfates in food, which was a rather exciting thing because sulfites and sulfates were killing people. In any event, it's my view that there may be some specific issues here that need to be addressed. And I'd like to assure the gentleman if he'd withdraw the amendment, we'd be glad to work with him to try and see how his concerns can be met without affecting adversely the content of the bill. And I think if the gentleman would cooperate with me on this, we can work this matter out.
Will the gentleman yield? I'm happy to. I would note that in your statement to me, there are areas in the FAA Act whereby there are, with example on labeling requirements, whereby it's outside of the MOU and FDA retains some of its authorities, and those would be such as for wine coolers, for example, instead of wine, if it's below a certain percentage of alcohol. So while both of these agencies have jurisdiction over alcohol, the MOU covers pretty much everything, but there are some things that fall out. What I was seeking to do, and I'll work with the gentleman between now and the full committee, is that we have a system in place that is working very well. And when you're seeking to bring them in now to these other requirements of record keeping, registration, track and trace requirements, fees, in a system whereby it's already working really well, I'll withdraw the amendment. I've worked well with the gentleman in the past, and I want to work and see if we can find an accommodation for all the members in which share this equal concern.
We're not out, if the gentleman would permit me to reclaim my time.
Yes.
We're not out to create troubles for BATF, although there have been times I did want to do so in other connection with other matters. But the harsh fact of the matter is, I'm not quite clear what this does, and I would observe that Food and Drug does regulate a lot of things, like food additives, things that fall into the category of medicine, colorings, flavorings, and things of that kind, which are heavily full of alcohol, because that's the only way you can get the particular substance into solution. And I just don't want to let those kinds of things come in or be manufactured in an unsafe fashion. So I'll be delighted to work with my friend. If he'll withdraw it, we'll try and get this fixed.
The gentleman has withdrawn the member.
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, I'm sorry. Mr. Barton.
I want to speak in favor of the amendment just briefly. Chairman Waxman, I don't believe, is in the room, but he and I have had several discussions over the course of the last several months about bipartisanship and working together. And in a meeting that I believe you were in, Chairman Pallone, with Mr. Deal and myself last week on the general issue of health care, I said don't automatically assume that because it's a Republican idea or amendment that it's bad. And generically, y'all agreed with that. People can look at sets of facts, the same set of facts, and come to different conclusions, and I think that's a situation that we have here. Chairman Dingell says that he's not trying to change the relationship between FDA and the Bureau of Alcohol and Tobacco Tax. Mr. Booyer says he's not either. He's just trying to make sure that the existing relationship stays the same, and since this is a bill about food safety and you know, the classic definition of alcohol, kind of generically, it can be classified as a food, but in reality, most of the alcohol products are not. So what Mr. Booyer is trying to do is maintain that relationship and say that this memorandum of understanding that Chairman Dingell has referenced remains as is. And Chairman Dingell says that he thinks this would undermine it, and Mr. Booyer says that he thinks it would ratify it. So here's if Mr. Booyer wants to withdraw this amendment, that's his prerogative. But I would hope between, if he does choose to do so, that between now and full committee, there really will be a meeting of the minds, because this is an example of an amendment that is not mischievous, it's not nefarious, it's not in any way intended to undermine the basic concept that's been worked out at the staff level and the member level. It's meant to make sure that these products that are sold in all of our districts are regulated like they have been under the regulatory authority that has been worked out. So I see no harm in the amendment. I respect Chairman Dingell, and if he thinks there is potential harm, I think we should work to solidify that, to alleviate that concern. But hopefully some version of this would be in the bill at full committee. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll be happy to yield.
Spoken against the amendment. I'm just saying that there are questions here that got to be answered, and I want to work with the gentleman. We want this a bipartisan bill, and I want to satisfy the gentleman from Indiana. I also want to see to it that we don't make any surprises for ourselves later on.
I understand.
If we work together, I think we can get this thing fixed up to satisfy everybody.
With that, I yield back.
Let me just mention, we have about 5 minutes. Does the gentleman seek to withdraw the amendment, or?
I'll withdraw the amendment, and we can go vote.
All right. Thank you. The amendment has been withdrawn. We have 3 votes. After those 3 votes, we'll come back immediately and begin with any other amendments to the manager's amendment. Subcommittee meeting is in recess.